That song is stuck in my head. Alright, let's post these links up in here. Then we gonna pin it like this, Hey. Black Power Nyah. Hey girl, how you doing?
Hey Nyah.
Black Power Comrade Cameron. Welcome. Black Power Comrade Diego. What's up, y'all? Happy Sunday. Happy Black Power Sunday.
Black Power Sunday.
I was about to say something else, but then my mind just went like, yeah.
Get up in here.
Yes, please put in the comments, #share when you have shared it. Let's get these views up. Let us get some likes and some hearts and stuff like that, because you know that messes with the algorithm and all that other kind of stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And you know that creates like a broader reach for the video, for more people to tune into the video. So come on, let's make it happen. Y'all share it to your groups, your personal pages. You know, if you like Nyah and you got like 5 different pages.
About to do that now. Share it all.
Oh yeah, Facebook. Make sure you do that as well too. So, hey. All right, let's go ahead and get this thing started. Welcome to the Revolutionary Book Trap with your boy Chief Dia and
Chief Nyah.
What's up, y'all? So y'all know we on this is our second book. No, our third book. This is our third book.
Let's see.
It's our fourth. Hold on, wait.
For the book club.
Oh yeah, it is.
Yeah.
See, my mind just be all over the place.
Thank
Thank you for sharing, Comrade Diego. Yes, y'all make sure y'all share. So, yes, welcome. Before we get started, we got a couple of announcements. What's coming up next month, Comrade Nyah?
So we got another food drive happening January the 11th. And we are going to do it at Woodruff Park and Hurst Park, where we are going to be meeting up at Central Park. It's going to be dope.
Yes.
Should I tell them what's on the menu?
Tell them, Comrade.
We're going to have stewed chicken.
Woo woo.
We're going to have yellow rice.
Woo woo.
We're going to have string beans.
Woo woo.
And we're going to have dinner rolls.
Blah, blah, blah.
I get excited when we talk about food. But yeah. So we're doing that. And then today, the East Coast area, they're having their meet and greet.
Yes.
So if you're in that area, Delaware, D.C. area, you should pay them a visit. I forgot where they're going to be at, but we do have an event created for it. So show support, donate, be up there.
Yes.
So.
And also, the Atlanta chapter will be taking our first trip to the gun range on the 28th of this month, December. So please, if you want to join us, I got to check in with Comrade Terry. I forgot the name of the gun range that we're going to. But we will be creating an event page on the Black Hammer Facebook page. So look for that. It's going to contain all the details. And we're going to shoot some shit.
Sharpen up your skills.
Okay. Black Power Comrade Ghazi. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And today we are jumping into chapter 2 of How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, again by Comrade Walter Rodney. And in the description of this video, we have the PDF link posted and the link to the audio book. So you got 2 choices of however you want to, participate and go along with us. So, yeah. We're doing it. Let's go ahead and get started. And so, chapter 2 is entitled How Africa Developed Before the Coming of the Europeans Up to the 15th Century. And so before we get into our summation, Comrade, now you want to read this quote at the beginning of the chapter?
Yes. It's the same one, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Before even the British came into relations with our people, we were a developed people, having our own institutions, having our own ideas of government. And that quote was by J.E. Casely Hayford, 1922. and he was an African nationalist.
Black power. So before we get into going to the summation, I just really want to appreciate Walter Rodney and his unbiasedness and his objectiveness in, the research in the history that this comrade has laid out. And I say that because upon reading like the first half of chapter 2, he lays out so many different things. He goes into explaining not only African societies, but human societies in general, and just the transitions that each society went through, in terms of development. And so what he says in the beginning here, Africa has had prolonged and extensive contact with Europe, and one has to bear in mind that contact between different societies changes their respective rates of development. To set the record straight, 4 operations are required, and this is what he breaks down. He says, reconstruction of the nature of development in Africa before the coming of Europeans, reconstruction of the nature of development which took place in Europe before expansion abroad, analysis of Africa's contribution to Europe's present developed state, and analysis of Europe's contribution to Africa's present undeveloped state. And what Comrade Walter does and makes plain in his analysis is the fact that all human societies in its beginning stages began with communalism, even meaning, Europe. Europe originally was a communal type society. But then he goes into, again, the different transitions that, different societies went through. And so mainly he's speaking about Africa right now at this point. Did you have anything Africa, Comrade?
I do, but we can go
Okay. So mainly what Comrade Walter is able to do in the first half of chapter 2 is just speak to the transitions that African societies were going through, prior to the invasion of European, colonizers before the 15th century. And so what he makes clear is that when you speak about, civilizations in regards to, Europe and all of these white imperialist countries and how all of these white imperialist countries came into being, what he says is that, okay, let's start here. Mainly, this stems from a desire to make comparisons with Europe, quote-unquote, civilizations. This is not the context in which to evaluate so-called civilizations of Europe. It is enough to note the behavior of European capitalists from the epoch of slavery through colonialism, fascism, and genocidal wars in Asia and in Africa. So this is pretty much, and to me, I feel like it's kind of shady. It's shade. Because when you think of civilization, you think about, these great contributions that this nation of people have contributed to the world, like all of these glorious structures like schools, your government system, and all of these different things like that. But as he says, this so-called civilization of Europe came into being through colonialism, fascism, and genocidal wars. So, and that's just the thing, because you have to understand, white power, white imperialism has been able to determine what civilization means to us, as colonized and oppressed people, colonized and African people. So when you think of civilization, Europe becomes the blueprint, because you have all of these, so-called advancements. But then, as Comrade Walter says, again, all of these advancements came through colonialism, fascism, and genocide. So how can any of this truly be, considered a civilization?
His next sentence says it all. Such barbarism causes suspicion to attach the use of the word civilization to describe Western Europe and North Africa. And if you look up, I'm somebody who likes to study the meaning of words and stuff like that, so I have no shame in saying that, if I'm reading and it's a word that I don't fully use a lot, I'll just look it up. Barbarism is just basically primitive, uncivilized way of living. You kill just to kill and to get what you want. Whereas civilization implies that you have a diplomatic way of handling things, trading, creating a dialectical relationship with other people that share the same planet or living space as you. And so I think he's highlighting, whereas Europeans say, well, we provided civilization to the majority of the world, and he's highlighting the dichotomy of that by saying it's actually a form of barbarism that they took to dominate the world. So, yeah, that was definitely shade.
Yeah. And then also, like, another thing, I just want to back up and just appreciate Walter again, because he is there's no type of, how do you say, there's no watering down about, the history and the facts that he presents. And he definitely makes it known that even prior to, Europeans invading Africa, there were different, portions of Africa that were developed in contrast to other areas within Africa. And then from there, he just goes into laying out like the different factors that affected, the development of Africa prior to the Europeans, coming to attack us. And the first thing he lays out is religion, how religion had an effect upon our development, within Africa. And he says, religion is an aspect of the superstructure of a society deriving ultimately from the degree of control and understanding of the material world. However, when man thinks in religious terms, he starts with the ideal rather than the material world, which is beyond his comprehension. So that's just like, when we think of how, even in not only just in African societies, but in human societies in general, like you have religion, which is used to explain things that you cannot understand. Like, just like when we hear our grandparents say, when it's thunder and the lightning, that's God speaking. You need to be quiet and all those different,
Stay off the phone.
Yeah, turn off the TV and things of that nature. So, and then he continues, he says, this creates a non-scientific and metaphysical way of viewing the world, which often conflicts with the scientific materialist outlook and with the development of society. African ancestral religions were no better or worse than other religions as such, but by the end of feudalism, and this is when we begin to see, like the difference between Africa developing, its societies versus Europeans in developing their society. And he says, by the end of feudalism, Europeans began to narrow the area of human life in which religion and the church played a part. Religion ceased to dominate politics, geography, medicine. To free those things from religious restraints, it had to be argued that religion had its own sphere and that things of this world had their own secular place. This secularization of life speeded up the development of capitalism and later socialism. In contrast, in the period before the coming of whites, religion pervaded African life just as it pervaded life in other pre-feudal societies, such as the Maoris of Australia or the Afghans of Afghanistan to the Vikings of Scandinavia. So, as you can see, like, how Comrade Rodney breaks it down is that, so if we're praying to, say for example, being that, African life, was steeped in religion and spirituality, there was no scientific motivation for us to, to create, let's see. So we understand that there's natural disasters that happen, all over the world. And of course, Africa is no exception from hurricanes and things of that nature. But when you put into context how an African would pray to an ancestor for protection against, this hurricane that may be coming versus, in Europe where they would say, okay, well, we need to assess the material conditions and then create, these institutions that may provide some form of protection. And this is not to say that Africans did not, work in a way where they could protect themselves, but this is just speaking to the reality of what really took place. And it has material effects, because again, if you're praying, if as an African, as a spiritual person, if you're praying for protection from the ancestors, that means that you're not necessarily worried about the material, consequences of what may come. And that's definitely not an indication of some backward understanding or, anything else of that nature. That's just, the terms, like Comrade Walter is saying, the rates of development. And you also have to bear in mind that Europeans, in their development, that was motivated by capitalism. Capitalism versus Africans, based in spiritualism and religion. So
I think it's just, it highlights the fact that Africans were more so at peace with nature, one with nature, in that they, if this happens to the land, we'll just build together and fix whatever damage is done after that. And whatever God or whatever deity they were praying to, they were at peace with that. You had brought up a good example earlier when we were discussing it, and I can't remember if it was something they discussed. I think it might have been something they discussed in the previous chapter, but about the forest and how, like, they might have said that the Europeans would have, we're going to cut this forest down because we need to erect this in order to produce wealth. Which, of course, at that time it wasn't called capital, but it was just wealth. We want to provide, lumber for trade or whatever. That's what we're going to do. Whereas the indigenous people of the African continent might have said, well, this forest has a spiritual or a sacred meaning to our land. We're not going to cut it down. Could it produce this wealth? Yes, but we're going to get the resources we're trying to use to do that from somewhere else, because we don't feel like it would be right for us to do that spiritually. So,
and just to deepen the understanding of what exactly the implications that religion had on development within Africa, Comrade Walter says, and this was the case in African societies as all pre-capitalist societies. So that means, it wasn't just, African people. Like, this was happening in China, India, again, in all societies pre-capitalism. So he says, at the same time, the religious beliefs themselves react upon the mode of production, further slowing up progress in that respect. For instance, belief in prayer and in the intervention of ancestors and various gods could easily be a substitute for innovations designed to control the impact of weather and environment. And he even also speaks to the negative aspects of religion, where he says the negative aspects usually arose out of the tendency of religion to persist unchanged for extremely long periods, especially when the technology of earning a living changes very slowly. So, yeah. So the next factor that he speaks to in terms of the development within Africa prior to European invasion is the predominant principles of social relations in Africa. And that is of family and kinship, which again is associated with communalism. So he lays out, that everybody within the society, you had a role, and those roles were determined in relation to, the relatives on your mother's side, all the relatives on your father's side. And, some societies, as he says, placed more importance on whether it was maternal or whether if it was, what is it?
Patrilineal.
Yeah,
Patrilineal, yeah.
Yeah. So, also, like, when you look at it, He says those things were crucial to the daily existence of a member of an African society because land was owned by groups such as the family or clan, the head of which were parents and those yet unborn. In theory, this pattern was explained by saying that the residents in any community were all direct descendants of the first person who settled the land. When a new group arrived, they often made a pretense that they too had ancestry dating back to the settling of the land, or else they ensured the members of the earliest kin groups continued to perform the ceremonies related to the land and water of the region. So a lot of the interaction between Africans on the continent was, and I mean, it's evident in how we interact with each other today. Like, you got your mama's side and you got your daddy's side. So meaning, like, either way, like, when you think of, in terms of, like, production, if everything is situated within the family, then there was no need for you to go and produce more than what you needed to take care of your family. Mm-hmm. And it's important for us to understand that as well, because when you think of, like, surplus and, the overproduction, mass production and things of that nature, all of that is capitalist, like, motivated. Mm-hmm. Like, it's not steeped in, it's not based in addressing the needs of the people. And yeah. So just for, like, an example, like, okay, he says, similarly, the labor that worked the land was generally recruited on a family basis. So everything had ties to, like, family. So he says a single family or household would till its own plots, and it would also be available to share certain joining farming activities with other members of the extended family or clan. Annual hunts and river fishing were also organized by a whole extended family or village community. In a matrilineal society such as the Bemba, the bridegroom spent a number of years working for the family of his bride, and many young men who had married daughters of the same household often formed work teams to help each other. So you just have to understand, like, okay, if this is how the labor of the land is structured, then obviously the development of the land or the area is not happening. It's not happening on a mass scale. Mm-hmm. And again, you have to be careful with that understanding, because this is Europe and white imperialism. This is how they have been able to determine what is developed and what is underdeveloped. So, for example, if all of Africa, isn't, developing, like, different technologies or different things of that nature, that's a measure of them being, backwards, uncivilized, and things of that nature. But to apply that type of general assessment is incorrect, because you have to take into account, like, all of the different structures that existed at that time within Africa before, slavery and things of that nature. So, yeah.
Well, I just want to remind people, if you guys have something that stood out to you in the chapter, please put it in the comments, because we want to hear what you have to say. We want this to be a discussion. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of information, especially, like, I would really like to hear more about what people think, especially as we see, Black people in the U.S. colony today, and some of those things that have even remained, like my comrade was saying just now, like, the things that we do now a lot of things are based on our kin or our family structures. I do feel like those types of things have continuously been attacked and are still being attacked today. We a lot of us have a more individualized mindset in that, well, I'm gonna do for me and mine, and even our especially, like, extended family relationships, those are not as valued as they once were. But that is something that has somehow remained evident even in our civilization today, and I really like that he studied and underlined this for us.
Yeah, and then, like, an even more, like, direct example of how he's like, the family ties and the kinship affect, the modes of production in Africa. He says, in both those examples, the right of the father-in-law to acquire labor and the obligations of the son-in-law to give labor were based on kinship. This can be contrasted with capitalism, where money buys labor, and with feudalism, where the serfs provide labor in order to have access to a portion of land which belongs to the landlord. So again, like if you live in a village where you're surrounded by your family and extended family, your kinship and things of that nature, your labor wasn't motivated by, capitalist gains or being able to make money, because you understood that as a member of that village, as a member of that family, that you had to do the work in order for your family to survive. So it wasn't anything that was built on, again, like capitalism.
Yeah, I appreciate that too, because he keeps bringing it up again, but basically the African way of the land was not at the expense of anybody else. Whereas what Europeans brought about was at the, somebody basically benefits off of the labor of many. And that's just exploitation.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate that, because he says somewhere in here that in this particular chapter that communalism was where everybody could access the land, everybody got the benefit of the food, everybody got the benefit. There was nobody that gained the overall benefit at the expense of others, and I just think that's something we really need to internalize.
Yeah. And then also he says, in all African societies during the early epoch, the individual at every stage of life had a series of duties and obligations to others in the society, as well as a set of rights, namely things that he or she could expect or demand from other individuals. Age was a most important factor determining the extent of right and obligations. That's why, it's so important that we see that even now and today, the respect of the elders, to respect, African sisters and brothers that are older than you. The oldest members of the society were highly respected and usually in authority. And the idea of seniority through age was reflected in the presence of age grades and age sets in many African societies. Circumcision meant initiation into the society and into adulthood. From that moment, a man was placed with others in his own age group, and a woman likewise. Usually, there were at least 3 age groups corresponding roughly to the young, the middle-aged, and the old. So again, Comrade Rodney is laying all of these things out to give us an understanding of how the modes of production worked in African society. And he even goes on to say that in large parts of Europe, when communalism broke down, it gave way to widespread slavery as a new form in which labor was mobilized. Versus African societies, when again, the labor was organized out of necessity, out of need, not of capitalist gain. And he says slavery continued throughout the European Middle Ages, with the Crusades between Christians and Muslims giving an added excuse for enslaving people. Slavery in turn gave way to serfdom, whereby the laborer was tied to the land and could no longer be sold or transported. So, yeah. And this is my hashtag, read that back. And do you have anything to offer before we move on?
We can move on.
Okay. So this is why I can just appreciate Comrade Rodney for being so objective and unbiased, and laying all of this shit out. Because we understand that all human societies have their contradictions, in terms of development and all of those different things like that. But this is really just like so powerful how he lays this out. And he says, in Africa, there were few slaves and there was certainly no epoch of slavery. Most of the slaves in North African and other Muslim societies, and in those instances, a man and his family could have the same slave status for generations within the overall feudal structure of the society. Elsewhere in Africa, communal societies were introduced to the concept of owning alien human beings when they took captives into war. So let me finish. At first, those captives were in a very disadvantaged position comparable to that of slaves, but very rapidly captives or their offsprings became ordinary members of the society because there was no scope for the perpetual exploitation of man by man in a context that was neither feudal nor capitalist.
Wow.
Like, how powerful is that?
The fact that it was more like, okay, you know, even in a situation of war, the captive had the ability to become a whole person or whole functioning citizen in that society without, for the rest of their lives or for generations, being held and coerced into labor.
I mean, like, the proof is in the pudding. And he even says, in Africa, after the communal stage, there was no epoch of slavery arising out of internal evolution. So this is even speaking to before, again, them white-ass settlers left their little rock in Europe and came to Africa to enslave us.
And I think this is something that people with the mindset that, you know, in Africa there was slavery, you had slavery or, you know, that type of thing. This is what you need to really study because it was not in the same aspect as the chattel slavery that Africans were subjected to under European rule.
We have a comment from Sid who says, today's America would be chaos with socialism. And you know what? To an extent, that's right. That is true. Because, I mean, America as it stands now is a capitalist society. It's a capitalist institution. So it's not our goal to, you know, try to emulate, you know, what the fuck is going on in America. Our goal is to overturn that shit so the indigenous people of this land can create their own socialist government in their own practices of socialism. So
he also Sid also said he said a couple of things before that I wanted to read. He said within most social groups there are the greedy and the most manipulative. Someone or some people will always be in control. Everyone will not benefit. Everyone will never agree. And then he also said those societies were inhuman only allowed some rights based on generational status, like that of the caste system of India, which he actually mentions caste.
He speaks to that
in African
civilization
as well.
Yeah. So pretty much like all of this, again, what Comrade Walter is laying out is the internal evolution of African society. So that means, you know, like the gradual progression of transitions, you know, of history of African society. So he says the assumption that would underlie this study is that most African societies before 1500 were in a transitional stage between the practice of agriculture, including fishing and herding, and family communities, and the practice of the same activities within states and societies comparable to feudalism. So pretty much he's saying, again, there was no, like, how Europe was able to transition from feudalism to capitalism was based on the strength of slavery. So that's when you saw like all of these different advancements taking place in Europe because, again, they came to Africa, enslaved us, and then this is where you see the development of all of these different, technologies, tools, and things of that nature.
And after they enslaved themselves, because they did that because, you know, okay, we need more labor, and we're better to do that than to go here in all this uncultivated land that we can take advantage of. And we need to get this out of we want our land to be further developed. Let's use these slaves here and pull them into it and, you know, get out of this ourselves. I mean, it's really important to understand that, because even where he's saying here about there were some societies in Africa that were comparable to feudalism, and that totally bypassed the system of slavery altogether. So
right, and he furthers that point, by saying, thus under communalism there were no classes and there was equal access to land and equality in distribution at a low level of technology and production. So meaning even without the advancements that you saw in Europe that again came as a consequence of slavery, there was still equal access to land and, you know, equality in distribution. So therefore there was no there was no motivation, for Africans to act in a way to, exploit each other.
Sid asks, in all honesty, look at Africa today. Have they come together as a people of an entire continent? Something new has to be attempted. But Sid, you also have to understand that Africa, the continent of Africa, is under colonial rule. Mm-hmm. The borders that are there now are colonial erected borders. Mm-hmm. Most of the societies or the countries that you would find in Africa today, they don't go by their indigenous societal rules that were implemented thousands of years ago or hundreds of years ago. And so you can't really take what Africa looks like today, since it has been under colonial rule and is still under colonial rule, and say this is the example of what we should be looking at and what it means to have it. This is the model. What everything has been infected by colonialism, Europeanism. It's not. That's why it's like even going to Africa today. I'm sure there are places in Africa that have been less affected by European rule or colonialism. However, the mass scale of it, all of your borders, they don't even speak their indigenous languages. They speak French. They speak whatever else. They speak English. So that is very evident of the fact that colonialism still it has infected every bit of where indigenous and African people are on the planet today.
Mm-hmm. And when you look at like any of these so-called, governments within Africa, all of those are puppet regimes that have been, put in place by white power, by white imperialism. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. So continuing, so just understanding that this whole Walter Rodney does say that feudalism, in some African societies, they did reach feudalism, but it was very, very few societies. And he says, so long as the feudal state was still in the making, elements that were communal coexisted with elements that were feudal and with some peculiarities due to African conditions. The transition was also characterized by a variety of social formations. There were pastoralists and cultivators, fishing societies and trading societies, raiders and nomads. They were all being progressively drawn into a relationship with the land, with each other, and with the state through the expansion of productive forces in the network of distribution. And just reading that passage makes me think, no matter at the rate, that Africa was developing, if it was slow or whatever, but what we have to understand is that Europe robbed us of the opportunity to see what transition would really look like from, the places that, as we could see, because again, it's already understood that we didn't transition from communalism into slavery. Mm-hmm. But we weren't given an opportunity to see again what that transition would take, what it would transform into because of the interruption of our way of life by, the colonizer.
I want to, because Sid had another comment. Mm-hmm. And the comment says, Africa had a slave system, which we just refuted that in this book that we just read. Had a slave system and an inhuman way of treating its own people based on even the primitive tribal system, that it was not a system that most people of non-third world citizens would agree with. I need to challenge you there, Sid. Where are you finding that information? Are you finding that information given to you by some Europeanized book or dialogue? I'm trying to understand, because here we are reading this book, which is challenging all of that. This is backed by...
Not challenging, just destroy that whole notion.
It's a lie. So I need to know where you're getting your information from, because that's the same narrative that would say that Africans sold their own people into slavery and they were complicit in why we're in the condition that we're in now. So I want to know where you're getting your information from, because here we are discussing this in as diplomatic and in intellectual ways we can. We're trying to develop a narrative that supports us rebuilding ourselves as a people. And we can't do that with the hatred of where we came from. We can't do that without trying to learn and sift through the lies that we've been fed. about what Africa was before Europe invaded and committed genocide on that land. So I do want to know where you're getting your information from, and maybe we can discuss that. Observable history and current events. I just got in here, observable history and current events. Okay, but we all also understand that colonialism is the reason why the world is where it is today.
So, I mean, like all research, and to be honest, if it's not conducted in a revolutionary way in order to place, because you can't, current events and what he said, objectable
he said
history?
just observable history. So
what exactly is observable history?
So you're saying that, okay, so Africa, with it being as undeveloped as it is, that's supposed to be the observable history, that we don't want to live in the way that Africans would have the world today, because we know that Europeans, this is a documented fact, that Europeans, everywhere they stepped, they committed genocide against every other people in order to get what they have today. In order for there to be a capitalistic economy that is flourishing in the way that it was, we have third world countries. That's how they became third world countries, because they have no dominance, they have no control over the land that they own. So I do want, you can continue to offer that, but it's a history of North Africa in comparisons to other societies outside of Africa. But again, that is due to European influence. Where have Europeans gone where they haven't forced their way into that particular indigenous people's land and taken what they wanted from it, and then exerted their dominance over that land?
Speaking of it. And I just want to say this, what he's raising about North Africa, even Comrade Walter speaks to that later on in this chapter. We're not going to get to that today, but I mean, and then this is the last thing I'm going to say, and then we're going to move on. Yeah, because first of all, we're dealing with the past 600 years of history that has been steeped in, again, like my comrade just said, colonialism and capitalism. And we live in a society where white imperialism has made it its job to rewrite history as we understand it. So anything that is provided to you is written in a biased way. And if the research is not conducted in a revolutionary way, then it's not founded in objectivism. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. And yeah, so
he mentions that Egypt had slaves. He does discuss Egypt and its founding, and we also know
we're gonna get to that. Like all of that is everything that you, and yes, he does. He even mentions the Moors and them enslaving other people. But again, we're gonna get there. But yeah. So further on in the chapter, this is, speaking of the transitions from communalism, to feudalism. He says, in feudal societies, there were clashes between the landlord and peasants, and later on between the landlord and merchant classes. Mm-hmm. Under capitalism, the principal class contradiction inside of Europe was between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Those hostile class relations provided the motive force within the respective societies. This is the difference, and now he's going to speak to the difference between what we see in European societies versus African societies.
Pay attention.
African communal societies had differences such as age grades and differences between ordinary members and religious leaders such as rainmakers. However, those were not exploitive or antagonistic relations. The concept of class as a motive force in social development had not yet come about. In the communal phase, one must look at the fundamental forces of production and to understand the process of change. Communal labor was entered into cross-section of the community to make work more efficient. The Dokwe work group of the hominy mentioned above had a wider application in serving the whole community to perform such heavy tasks as clearing land and house building. With the offer of some food and beer or palm wine, a work team or worker bee could be mobilized in a short time in most African communities, including those of the light-skinned Berbers of North Africa. So, yeah. I think I saw, did Alex McCoy, I think Comrade Alex,
Commented?
yeah,
Let's see.
that he had to read that.
Okay, yeah. Let's see. Alex said, you saying you were on the ground for this historical accounts have authors. We need to thoroughly investigate the motives of those authors. Like Chief Nyah said, the European motive was theft, absolutely, and the eraser of history.
Go back up some more.
Up some more. Oh, yeah, it's way back there. Sorry, Alex. When an outsider comes into new ecological system, even if he is more skilled, he does not necessarily function as effectively as those who have familiarized themselves with the environment over centuries. Absolutely.
Black power.
There's a question that he did ask that I want to answer before we end. Is what is revolution for you? I won't do that now while we're going through.
Okay.
And I want to know your answer. If you could go ahead and post your answer, I would like to see that.
Yeah.
What is revolution for you?
So continuing on in the chapter, Comrade Walter goes on to speak about, production and the change in the productive forces. So when in the breakdown he says, the first prerequisite for mastery of the environment is knowledge of that environment. By the 15th century, Africans were everywhere had arrived at a considerable understanding of the total ecology of the soils, climate, animals, plants, and their multiple interrelationships. Right. The practical application of this lay in the need to trap animals, to build houses, to make utensils, to find medicine, and above all, to devise systems of agriculture. In the centuries before the contact with Europeans, the overwhelmingly dominant activity in Africa was agriculture. In all the settlement agricultural communities, people observed the peculiarity of their own environment and tried to find techniques for dealing with it in a rational manner. Advanced methods were used in some areas such as terracing, crop rotation, green manuring, mixed farming, and regulated swamp farming. The single most important technological change underlying African agriculture development was the introduction of iron tools, notably the axe and the hoe, replacing wooden and stone tools. It was on the basis of the iron tools that new skills were elaborated in agriculture as well as in the spheres of economic activity. So again, this is speaking to, the necessity to provide in abundance. Like, again, if in these different, African societies, like, we have to understand that we're all developing at different rates. Mm-hmm. So again, that is going to affect the different amount of, things that can be produced at a time. The whole contradiction that we're speaking to is that, again, African people were not able to fully transition into another, a phase of development because, again, it was interrupted by colonialism. It was interrupted by capitalism. And another weakness that Comrade Walter points out is that he says the weakness in Africa seemed to have been the lack of a professional interest in acquiring more scientific knowledge and in devising tools to lighten the load of labor, as well as the transformation transform hostile environments into areas suitable for human activity. As far as agriculture in Europe was concerned, this professionalism was undertaken by the class with a vested interest in the land, namely the feudalist landlords and later the capitalist farmers. So again, all of this expansion this so-called expansion that you see,
the benefit of a few, the benefit of a ruling class, not for the benefit of all. It was at the expense of all, and there was the benefit of the ruling class to set themselves up to dominate everything, the economy, the resources. That's why you have to work in the manner in which you do just to survive.
Mm-hmm. And to even further what my comrade is saying, see, this is why niggas gotta read. You have to read, and you have to do your research, because other than that, you just making claims.
And you buying into the narrative that's been fed to you.
Exactly.
To keep you in a position of just feeling like, okay, well, I have to do this. We have to go by what the powers that be say because that's what they say to do. Wow.
And to even deepen what you just said, Comrade Nyah, he says, where a few people owned the land and the majority were tenants, this injustice at a particular stage of history allowed the few to concentrate on improving their land. In contrast, under communalism, every African was assured sufficient land to meet his own needs by virtue of being a member of a family or community. For that reason, and because land was relatively abundant, there were few social pressures or incentives for technical changes to increase productivity. So again, what we see in Europe and other white imperialist countries is not productivity that is done in a way to meet the needs of the community. Is done in a way to meet the needs of the few that controls the masses of the people. And I don't know what else we can say to make it evident other than what we're reading, that African people are inherently a communal people. Just like, and again, just being objective in your research, like he says, like Walter says, like all human societies began this way. All human societies began this way. But when you look at Europe, in the history of Europe, they, again, brought along capitalism and exploitation. So for us to sit here and try to, argue that Africa has slavery and, all of these different things, at no point in time are we saying that Africa did not have its own contradictions. That there were not, some inhumane or backward practices, but I mean, even that could be spoken to, and it's going to be laid out in the chapter when we get further to it.
Well, and I want to say something because, Sid said this later. He said, I love you guys, honestly, take no offense to me. The discussion is good. I just want to make sure that we're all kind of reading the same stuff because there's a foundation as to how this economic system that we're living under now has come to be. And that's what Rodney is outlining here. Also, he wants to outline the way that things were done in Africa. He does speak deeply about Egypt. He does speak about Ethiopia, how Christianity, from almost its inception, found its way into Africa. So there's a lot of people who feel like Christianity had its foundation in Africa, or had its inception in Africa. Okay, that's fine. That's what we're discussing. Nobody here today was there then living to really be able to account for all of that. But we have somebody who has studied it, and we are here to discuss it. We're all trying to decolonize the way we think, myself included, my comrade. But we do have to recognize and unpack when there are things that are so imbued in us that it fits the narrative of the colonizer, of the oppressor, and we have to challenge those ideas.
That was so right on, comrade. Like, that was so powerful. Black power. So, yeah. And, I think I saw him say maybe the way our delivery is, being misinterpreted.
Perhaps.
But it may be. But this is coming from a revolutionary love, for our people, because just like Comrade Nyah just said, we're all in a situation to where we have to decolonize, how we think. And then again, we don't know, like, this book was written in 1969.
Yeah.
Like, we are all trying to overturn 600 years worth of colonization within ourselves. And so when we come across, like findings like books like these and other revolutionary pieces, you have to understand that, again, this research that Walter Rodney did is a tool for us to further, decolonize our minds and dispel the narrative that white imperialism has placed upon us. And then again, when you look at all of these research papers, all of these historic theses and all of those things like that, they're written in a biased way. Because again, for the oppressor to give us the unfiltered type truth of, anything like that of that nature, it forces the hands of colonized and African people to react in a revolutionary way. And that is why we see it is so evident in, in society as it stands now that we don't have access to this type of information. That even, I think I heard some, in a comment, I think somebody even said that this book is banned in some libraries. So you all, like Comrade Nyah just said, you always have to question where are you receiving your information from. And it shouldn't, I feel like white imperialism has, conditioned us in a way to where we don't question anything that is put out by white imperialism. Like, if they say it is so, it is so. But when we see stuff coming from our own people that speaks to our history or is laying something out to our history, we have to question every little thing. We have to question every single little thing. And again, I mean, it's just evident of how, how colonialism has just been forced upon us as a people.
It is. And I mean, and on top of that, so many, where are the majority of the people that write these types of books? Are they still living?
No. And at the beginning of this man was assassinated. He was assassinated. So what would be the point of taking the life of this brother if he was just giving us the history of Africa? Like, what would be the motivating forces to assassinate this African man for just putting out this information? Those are the types of questions that you have to ask yourself.
And what is the benefit of us remaining uninformed? Once upon a time when we were brought here, again, we were stripped of our languages, our indigenous spirituality. Many of those languages we'll never reconnect to. No. Ever.
Absolutely. Who's still living?
Absolutely still living. I don't know. I'm just saying, we're making the point that people that write this type of literature typically are not allowed to persist to live, in that they are a danger to the status quo. And that's very, I mean, that is duplicated over and over again in history. There might be some anomalies of people who escape that, but it's not common at all.
But because I want to, because we were just speaking about the Moors and how Sid was, saying, it was slavery and all of these other types of things like that. We've come to the portion of this chapter where Walter Rodney speaks to all of that. And he says, in some instances, the cultivators had the upper hand, as for instance, in West Africa, where cultivators were like the Mandinga in Hausa, I'm sorry, I know I'm pronouncing that wrong, were the overlords of the Rulani cattlemen right up to the 18th and 19th century. The reverse situation was found in the Horn of Africa and most of East Africa. Another type of clash was that in which raiding peoples took power over agriculturalists, as happened in Angola and in around the Sahara, where the Moors, like you just mentioned, where the Moors and the Tuareg extracted tribute from and even enslaved more peaceful and sedentary peoples. The result in each case was that a relatively small faction held control of the land, in where relevant, cattle mines and long-distance trade routes. It meant also that the minority group could also make demands on the labor of their subjects, not on the basis of kinship, but because of a relationship of domination and subordination existed.
Exploitation.
In truly communal societies, the leadership was based on religion and family ties. The senior members of the society shared the work with others and received more or less the same share of the total product. Certainly, no one starved while others stuffed themselves and threw away the access. However, once African societies begin to expand by internal evolution, conquest, or trade, the style of life of the ruling group became noticeably different. They consumed the most and the best that society had to offer. Yet, they were least directly involved in the production of wealth by farming, cattle herding, or fishing. The ruling class and the king in particular had the right to call upon the labor of the common man for certain projects and for a given number of days per year. This is known as corvée labor, from a similar procedure followed in feudal France. Yeah. Such a system meant greater exploitation and at the same time greater development for productive resources. So again, we're not saying that Africa was not free of contradictions and, free of contradictions. And Comrade Rodney lays that out. But what we have to internalize and understand is that it wasn't African people who created a whole global economy system such as capitalism out of slavery. Even if, and like he just said, if it was pockets in societies that had slavery, it was not used to usher in again a whole world economy that the rest of the world was dragged into by Europe in white imperialism.
Right, because he mentions that also happened in pockets in Asia, in parts of Asia.
Mm-hmm.
So we, yes, we're aware of that. And that is what he's not trying to hide that, but the way of the land. And he also mentions that Africa had, first of all, Africa is a huge ass continent, mm-hmm. the second largest on the planet. So you have people that were scattered about. So you had this clan of people, you had this clan of people and their way of doing things. And while there were similarities in a lot of those different societies or groups of people, there were also differences in the way that they came to be. There were wars between tribes, nobody's refuting that, mm-hmm. but that wasn't the typical way of going about doing things, trading. Mm-hmm. It was on a communalistic type of way, diplomatic. Share the land. We all live here within this radius of each other. You make this, we make that. Let's trade. Mm-hmm. And so that's not being debated. It's being debated that Africans on a large scale were implicit in bringing about the capitalist system mm-hmm. that we see today, mm-hmm. and that they were implicit in their underdevelopment mm-hmm. compared to European or Westernized civilizations that we see today. Mm-hmm. That's what's being debated.
Yeah. Black power. I think I saw another hashtag. Read that back.
Says it a bit back. Let's see here. Okay. Social stratification was the basis. This is Alex McCoy. Social stratification was the basis for the rise of classes and for the social antagonisms. Yes, that is absolutely correct. He did say that. Walter Rodney already said that communalism was a classless society. Did you ever read that chapter?
Black power. Yeah.
Okay, so Sid is asking us what revolution is to us. He's asking if we know of Frances Cress Wilson. I have read her book, The ISIS Papers. I know she has another text out there I intend to read. We have to keep in mind that we can't defeat the oppressor with the same thinking, and we must make sure that our thinking reflects the time that we are in. But the time that we're in is under a system of colonialism, capitalism, and we're trying to do away with that. It says, baby, that information is very accessible. No shade with the baby statement. He's talking about the accessibility to the book. Just because we don't agree entirely doesn't mean it has to be dismissed as the white man's perspective within social groups, that there are disagreements. There are disagreements within social groups. But you also have to understand there is a certain narrative that is being fed. When we just got finished reading Huey Newton's book, the Black Panther Party was viewed as the largest threat to the structure of the U.S., and they needed to be destroyed. In order to make that happen, that's why they formulated COINTELPRO. They had black people thinking that the Black Panther Party was an enemy to the people. You had black people that were willing to go up and testify falsely, lying, saying that they saw things that they did not see because of the dominance of capitalism and what that meant for them on an individual scale. Of course, there is a narrative that's being fed to you. Let's say I hope I read what you asked me to read, Sid. I'm not trying to, so being happy with less versus being happy with more is overall idea here. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and define what revolution is to us. You go ahead, you start.
Black power. Revolution for me, in terms of, I would be remiss to say that first of all, we understand that revolution is a process. Mm-hmm. And through the process of revolution, we're trying to achieve liberation and freedom, for African people all around the world to have access to Africa, to have access to our resources, and to have those things brought into an all-socialist African government. Mm-hmm. So that's what revolution is to me. Revolution is taking down this capitalist United States government here in America and then returning the land to the indigenous people of this land. Mm-hmm. So...
Yeah. Very similar. This is not the land that we were forced here as African people. I would not be speaking to you in the language that I'm speaking to you now. I'm speaking to you in the English language because my ancestors were stolen from somewhere on the west coast of Africa, brought here, forced to work for centuries against their will, no pay, and their language, their indigenous beliefs were stolen from them, and now here I am. Revolution to me is the means to be able to control the means of production. Since I am an African, then my land is Africa, and I want to be able, and Africa is a very rich land. Mm-hmm. We know that, and he has already laid that out. Many of the world's natural resources comes from that continent. And the fact that under capitalist trade agreements that all of those resources to come there are either stolen from there and given and traded at such a value that Africa doesn't benefit from the capitalists, like diamonds, for mm-hmm. example. There is no wealth that goes back into Africa from the trade of diamonds. Mm-hmm. We want the means to control those resources because that is our land. I want to be able to reconnect with, as much as possible, a cultural revolution with what I would be and as much as I could be an African, because that was stolen from me. I didn't have a choice in that manner. So those are two sides. Basically, what my comrade said, that is revolution for me. And that also means to let go of the idea. You said something along the lines that being happy with less and
versus being happy
with more is the idea here.
I still don't understand
the idea. Well, he's saying basically we have a surplus. We have access to a surplus of things, but that's because of theft. Mm-hmm. That's the thing we're trying to get through to you. Mm-hmm. That the reason why there's a surplus with having here, or what it feels like. You being an African in the westernized world is because you have access to things by default being born there, mm-hmm. Or moving there, because you live in a society that steals its resources and its ability to produce that on a wide scale from third world countries, mm-hmm. so to speak. So being happy with less, I don't think that we would be getting less because we wouldn't be seeing what we're seeing is done to African people on a wide scale. Mm-hmm. Most African people are starving. Mm-hmm. Most African people don't have access to a home. I mean, even here in the U.S., that's the reason why we're doing food drives, because niggas ain't eating, mm-hmm. okay? So, you might be comfortable. I may be comfortable to some degree. But I'm also having to sell labor in order to make a living for my family. So in order for me to partake in bringing revolution about, that is sacrifice by the fact that I have to find a way to provide a living, to partake in the colonialized workforce in order to make a living for my family. I don't have a choice in the matter. Mm-hmm. So I do think that it is.
Damn, comrade.
What? I'm just saying, I get passionate about these things because it's like we are trying to bring. So communalism or socialism is a way for us to bring back the means of production ourselves. Everything that we see in colonial society, we could have built ourselves. We can build that ourselves. We do not. What did Kasi say? I can't see from this far, but I know he cutting up.
Yeah, cause see, Nyah is so diplomatic.
I am diplomatic, but I'm trying not to get us cut off. But I'm just saying that we have a lot to unpack here.
We do. So we're gonna go ahead and close for today. And so our next reading assignment this chapter is really long because in the next portion of the chapter he's going to speak to the different examples of how the state, the apparatus of the state came into being on the continent of Africa. And so he uses some examples, of different countries such as Egypt, Ethiopia, Nubia, Morocco, Western Sudan, and other areas as well. So but I also want to say that it's important I really want comrades, don't come to the discussion, to just hear what myself and Comrade Nyah have to say. You have to participate in this discussion and you have to read. Because it's a lot of things that we weren't even able to speak to go into that Comrade Walter laid out. And it's just so extensive. It's really so extensive. So
it's a lot. Some of it is worth going back and reading again because it's something that some of this is foreign concepts to us. But again, when you've been living in a capitalist society since you were born, and then the generations of people before you were also, my parents don't understand. This is totally foreign to them too. But this is the only way that we're going to get it is by studying what those that came before us that were not afraid to write this and study this and bring this to us brought to us. And I refuse to allow their work to be given to us in vain. I refuse.
So what our next reading assignment is going to be.
Do they end of chapter 2?
No, because girl,
we'll be reading a while.
Yes. We're going to read from some concrete examples, beginning, and it starts with Egypt, all the way up until the interlacristan zone.
Hold on a second, let me find that in my book. Oh, okay, I see.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So again, we're going to read, we're going to be doing, we're going to read from some concrete examples up into the interlacristan zone. So that's going to be our next reading assignment. So please make sure you read, bring your hashtag, read that back. And let's have a great revolution. I really appreciate my comrades so much.
Appreciate you.
I appreciate my comrades. Yes, you need it. And Abdias, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, but the PDF is in the description link, and we also have the link to the audio book in the description link as well. So if you don't want to read, you can listen to it. If you don't want to listen to it, you can read it. Okay.
We just want you in this discussion because it's so important that we get this information one way or the other.
Yeah. So. And I just want to say really quickly, that as materialists, we definitely understand that, you know, the ideals and the theories of the past can't be used as a generalization to speak to the contradictions that we see now. Mm-hmm. But it's important that we discuss and we look back so that way we can put in context the mistakes, the loopholes, the contradictions of what was done in the past, so that way we can tailor it to what's happening right now in the future. And if you aren't moving like that as a revolutionary, then your work, there's no work. How is your work being done? How is it being completed?
Mm-hmm. You're just basically redoing something again and are going to fail again. So we do need to learn from our mistakes.
And then even based on the strength of that, it's important for us to read books like this, because this is where we get our information from. This is how we are able to put into context what we are experiencing now. How did African people come to live under colonialism? How did we come to live under capitalism? So, yeah. And a lot, I ain't gonna even say that. But Black Power Comrades, meet us back here, same time, same place. The Revolutionary Book Trap with your boy Chief Dia and your girl Chief Nyah. And we gonna give it to you each and every single time.
That's right.
Black Power. Woo, Lord.